He took my hand so suddenly that I spilled my wine. I hadn't even noticed him walking toward me. One moment, I was standing near the edge of the room, holding my glass and pretending to admire a photograph on the wall. And the next, an older man in a charcoal blazer had his fingers wrapped around my wrist, staring at the ring on my right hand like he'd seen a ghost. "Where did you get that?" he asked. His voice was low. Careful. Like he was afraid of the answer. I looked down at the ring, then back at him. His face had gone the color of old paper. "It was my grandfather's," I said. He didn't let go. My grandfather died on a Tuesday in February in a long-term care facility in Sudbury, Ontario, room 14B. I know the room number because I was the one who cleaned it out. My parents weren't there. My aunt wasn't there. My uncle, my grandfather's own son, called me the morning of the funeral and said the roads were bad and that he'd try to make it for the reception. He didn't. I drove 4 hours from Ottawa in a snowstorm. I was the only one at the graveside service besides the funeral home director and a chaplain the facility had arranged. They placed a small Canadian flag on the casket, the kind they give to veterans. I didn't even know my grandfather was a veteran. That's the part that still sits heavy with me. I didn't know. His name was Leonard. Everyone called him Len. He was 81 years old and he had spent the last 4 years of his life in that facility, and in those 4 years I had visited him 11 times. I counted after, 11 times in 4 years. I'm not proud of that number. I tell myself I was busy, finishing my degree, starting a job in Ottawa, building a life. But the truth is that the distance between Ottawa and Sudbury is 4 hours, not 4 days, and I chose not to make that drive more often. I chose other things instead. My parents had stopped visiting years before I did. My grandfather and my father had a falling out when I was a teenager. Something about money. Something about a property in New Liskeard that my grandfather had sold without telling anyone. My father never fully explained it. He just stopped calling. My mother followed because that's what she did. She followed my father's silences the way water follows a slope. So it was me, occasionally, and then it was no one. I cleaned out his room alone. The facility gave me a cardboard box and told me to take my time. There wasn't much. A few flannel shirts, a Bible with a cracked spine, a photograph of my grandmother, who had died before I was born, a coffee mug from Algonquin Park that I remembered from his kitchen when I was a child, and at the bottom of the box, wrapped in a grocery bag that had been folded and refolded until it was soft as cloth, was a ring. It was a man's ring, plain silver, heavier than it looked. On the inside of the band, there was an engraving. Small letters, worn down but still legible, CU for/faithful in silence. I didn't know what that meant. I put it in my coat pocket. I didn't tell anyone I'd found it because there was no one to tell. I started wearing it a few weeks later. Not because I thought it was valuable, just because it was his, and I felt like someone should carry it. The event where the man stopped me was a fundraising gala for a veterans organization in Ottawa. My colleague had 2 tickets she couldn't use and offered them to me. I almost said no. I wasn't much for formal events, but she said there would be a good dinner and an open bar, and I'd had a hard week, so I went. I didn't know anyone there. I stood near the edges of things, the way you do when you're alone at an event full of people who all seem to know each other. The room was full of older men and women, many of them with medals pinned to their jackets. I felt like an imposter. I had been there about an hour when the man came toward me. His name, I would learn later, was Douglas. He was 73 years old. He walked with a slight stiffness in his right leg that I noticed when he finally released my wrist and stepped back. "I'm sorry," he said. "I didn't mean to frighten you. It's just that ring. I haven't seen one of those in a very long time." "It was my grandfather's," I said again. Leonard Hardy. He died in February. Something moved across his face. A kind of slow recognition, like a light being turned up from somewhere far away. "Len," he said quietly. "You're Len's granddaughter." It wasn't a question. We found 2 chairs near the back of the room. Douglas set his own drink down and laced his fingers together on his knee and looked at me for a long moment before he spoke. "How much do you know about your grandfather's work?" he asked. "He was a machinist," I said. He worked at a mining equipment plant in Sudbury for most of his life. Douglas nodded slowly. He did work there. That part is true. He paused, but that wasn't all he did. He spoke carefully. There were things he said he couldn't tell me. Not fully, not yet, maybe not ever. There were files that were still sealed, programs that officially didn't exist. But he told me enough. My grandfather had been recruited in the early 1970s through a federal program that no longer operated under that name. It had something to do with cross-border intelligence, economic intelligence. Douglas called it, not the dramatic kind you see in films, not dead drops and car chases. Quieter than that. My grandfather, with his access to industrial equipment suppliers and his regular trips to trade shows across Ontario and Quebec and sometimes into the northern United States, had spent nearly 2 decades passing information through channels I didn't fully understand to people I would never meet. He had been, in the language Douglas used, a passive asset. Someone whose ordinary life was a perfect cover precisely because it was ordinary. He had never been in uniform. He had never fired a weapon. He had sat in meeting rooms and on trade show floors and at lunch counters in Sault Ste. Marie and Timmins and Thunder Bay, and he had listened, and he had reported, and he had gone home and eaten supper with my grandmother and never said a word. The ring was given to people in the program, a way of identifying each other without speaking. Faithful in silence. Douglas had one too, he told me. He reached into the collar of his shirt and pulled out a thin silver chain. On it hung a ring identical to my grandfather's. I knew Len for almost 20 years, he said. We were never supposed to acknowledge each other in public. That was the rule. But I knew his face. I knew his voice. And I knew that ring. He looked at his hands. When he disappeared from the circuit around 1994, we were told he'd retired, that his cover had simply run its natural course. I never heard from him again. I thought about 1994. I would have been about 2 years old. My father and grandfather had still been speaking men, I thought, though barely. The falling out came later. He never told anyone, I said. It came out smaller than I meant it to. He couldn't, Douglas said. That was the agreement. That was the whole point. I drove home that night in silence. I didn't turn on the radio. I just drove through the wet March streets of Ottawa and thought about my grandfather's hands. He had big hands. I remembered that. When I was small and he took me fishing at a lake north of Sudbury, his hands seemed enormous on the fishing rod, careful and slow. He never talked much. I used to think he was just a quiet man, the kind of man who didn't have a lot to say. My father used to say he was cold, closed off, hard to love. I thought about that now, how many years my grandfather had spent being someone who couldn't speak, not because he had nothing to say, but because silence was the job. Because the agreement he had made required him to carry things that he could never put down and never hand to anyone else. And then his son had called him cold, and stopped calling, and his granddaughter had visited 11 times in 4 years. I pulled into my parking spot and sat in the car for a long time. The heat ran out and I didn't restart it. I just sat there in the February cold. No, it was March by then, but it felt like February. And I thought about room 14B, the folded grocery bag, the ring wrapped up like something fragile. He had wrapped it up himself. He knew someone would find it eventually. He'd chosen to leave it where it could be found. I think that was the only way he knew how to say it. I called my father the next day. This was not a simple thing. We spoke a few times a year. Christmas, my birthday, occasionally when something practical required it. There was always a layer of careful distance in our conversations, a politeness that had calcified over years into something neither of us knew how to break through. I told him what I had found. I told him about the Gala and Douglas and the ring and the program that didn't have a name anymore. I told him what his father had done for 20 years while my father was growing up in that house in Sudbury, eating supper across the table from a man who was carrying something my father never knew about. My father was quiet for a long time. That can't be right, he said finally. I know it sounds strange, I said. No, he said, and his voice was different than I expected. Slower. I believe you. I just mean, he stopped. Started again. He never said anything. In all those years, he never said anything. In all those years, he never said a word. He wasn't allowed to. Another long silence. We had a fight, my father said. I knew which one he meant. About the property. About money. I said things. He paused. I told him he'd never done anything that mattered, that he'd wasted his life being nobody. I didn't say anything. He didn't defend himself, my father said. He just stood there and took it. I thought that meant I was right, that he had nothing to say for himself. His voice, when it came back, was unsteady. He couldn't tell me. No, I said, he couldn't. My father drove to Sudbury 2 weeks later. He went to the cemetery alone. I didn't go with him. He didn't ask, and I think he needed to do it alone. He told me afterward that he'd stood at the grave for almost an hour, that he'd talked, which surprised me. My father was not a man who talked to graves, or to anyone, really. He said he didn't know if it helped. He said he didn't know if anything could help with something like that. But I went, he said. That felt like something. It is something, I said. He started calling more after that. Not dramatically more. He wasn't a changed man in the way that happens in movies. But the careful politeness thinned a little. He asked real questions sometimes. He told me things I hadn't known before. Small stories from when he was a boy. Things about my grandfather when he was younger. A camping trip they'd taken to Killarney. A hockey game my grandfather had coached when my father was 12. Small things. True things. It wasn't a repair exactly. Some things that break can't be put back together the way they were. But it was a beginning of something, and I think my grandfather would have understood that better than anyone. He had spent his whole life understanding that most of the important things happened slowly, quietly, out of sight of the people who might have recognized them. Douglas and I met for coffee a few months later. He had reached out through the Veterans Organization with a phone number and a brief note that said he'd be glad to tell me more if I wanted to know. I did want to know. He told me about a time in 1983 when my grandfather had passed information that had helped disrupt a supply chain that was funneling equipment to a regime that shouldn't have had it. He told me this carefully, with large gaps where the specifics should have been, but the shape of it was clear enough. He told me my grandfather had done this while attending a trade show in Montreal, while staying in a mid-range hotel, while eating breakfast alone at a diner on Saint Laurent before the show floor opened. Nobody knew, Douglas said. Nobody in that diner. Nobody at the show. His colleagues thought he was just a man who liked to get up early. He always got up early, I said. I hadn't thought about that in years. He was always the first one awake when I stayed with him as a child. I used to hear him moving around in the kitchen before sunrise, quiet as a habit. He was careful, Douglas said. He was very, very careful for a very long time. And then he retired, and he was still careful because that was what he knew how to be. He turned his coffee cup in his hands. I always wondered if that was hard, being done, but still carrying it. I thought about the last few years of his life. The facility in Sudbury. The flannel shirts. The quiet room. The ring wrapped in a grocery bag. I think he was ready to let someone else carry it, I said. Douglas looked at me for a moment. Then he nodded. I think you might be right. I still wear the ring. Right hand, third finger. It's too big for most of my fingers, but that one works well enough with a small adjustment I had a jewelry make, just a sizing insert, nothing that changed the ring itself. The engraving is still there, SEU4, faithful in silence. People notice it sometimes. They ask if it's a family piece. I say yes, and that's true, and usually that's where the conversation ends. Once in a while, someone presses further, and I tell them a little, that it was my grandfather's, that he did quiet work for a long time, that he was a man who mattered more than the people closest to him ever knew. I don't tell the whole story every time. Some of it still isn't mine to tell, but some of it is. There's a version of my grandfather's life that looks like nothing. A machinist from Sudbury, a man who didn't talk much, a father his son grew up not fully understanding, a grandfather his granddaughter visited 11 times in 4 years, A man who died alone on a Tuesday in February with very few people to notice. That version is true as far as it goes. But there's another version underneath it, and the two versions existed in the same body, in the same quiet hands, at the same breakfast table every morning for decades. He held both without complaint. He held them carefully, and he held them alone. And he never asked anyone to thank him for it. The flag they put on his casket was small, the kind they use when there isn't a formal military service. I kept it. It's folded in my apartment now, in the top drawer of my desk, next to the photograph of him I took from room 14B, the one of my grandmother, young and laughing at something just outside the frame. He kept that photograph his whole life. He carried it to every move, every facility, every room that became home for a while. He kept it because she was the one person he could be fully honest with. She knew. She was the only one who knew, and she took it with her when she died, and after that, he carried it alone. I think about that sometimes, what it means to be known by one person, and then to lose that person, and to keep going anyway. To keep being careful. To keep showing up at trade shows and eating breakfast alone and doing the quiet, invisible work that holds things together, even when there's no one left who understands why. The world is full of people like my grandfather. I believe that now in a way I didn't before. People who chose something difficult and chose it quietly, without ceremony, and kept choosing it long after anyone stopped asking. They're at breakfast counters and hockey rinks and long-term care facilities in cities all across this country. And most of them will never be in any record that anyone can read, and they went anyway. I think about that when the ring catches the light. I think someone should say thank you, even now. Even late, even when the person you're thanking can no longer hear it. So I say it. Quietly, because that feels right, because that's what he would have understood. I think about the grocery bag a lot. The way it had been folded and refolded until it was soft, almost like fabric. That doesn't happen by accident. Someone did that deliberately over time, handling it carefully again and again. My grandfather knew what he was wrapping. He knew someone would eventually open it. That's the thing that undoes me a little, still. He didn't leave a note. He didn't leave an explanation. He just wrapped the ring in something soft and placed it at the bottom of a box, and he trusted that whoever found it would carry it forward somehow. That's not passivity. That's a specific kind of faith, not in anything supernatural, but in the simple idea that honesty, even delayed, even silent, eventually finds its way through. My grandfather spent decades making a choice that nobody around him understood. He couldn't explain it. He couldn't defend himself when my father told him he'd wasted his life being nobody. He just stood there and absorbed it because the alternative was breaking a promise that mattered more than being understood. I used to think that kind of silence was weakness. Now I think it might be one of the harder things a person can do. To know your own worth clearly enough that you don't need someone else to confirm it. To act rightly and then let the record be whatever it's going to be. There's a word for that, I think, though it doesn't translate neatly into anything short. It's the quality of doing the decent thing even when no one is watching, and especially when no one will ever know. My grandfather had it in abundance. He had it in the way he got up before sunrise every morning, in the way he ate breakfast alone in hotel diners in cities where nobody knew his name and did what he'd agreed to do, and then drove home and said nothing. And the intelligence part, not cleverness, but genuine understanding, was knowing that what he was doing mattered even without an audience. That value doesn't require witnesses, that a thing can be real and significant and entirely invisible at the same time. He understood that in a way his own family didn't, and that gap cost all of them something. It cost my father years of resentment built on a foundation that turned out to be wrong. It cost me 11 visits when there could have been 40. But here's what I keep coming back to. He kept going anyway. After my grandmother died and took his only confidant with her. After his son stopped calling. After the years in that facility when the visits thinned out and then stopped. He kept being who he was. He didn't collapse into bitterness. He folded that grocery bag soft and left the ring where it could be found. That's the part I want to carry forward. Not just the knowledge of what he did, but the way he stayed himself while doing it. The endurance of it, the decision, made quietly every single day, to keep being a person of substance even when the people closest to him couldn't see it. My father went to the grave alone. He talked. He didn't know if it helped. But he went, and he kept going, back to calling more often, back to telling small stories, back towards something. That matters too. It's never the right time until you decide it is. The ring is still on my hand. I look at it sometimes when I'm tired or when something feels harder than it should. Faithful in silence. 4 words that took me 26 years and a stranger at a gala to understand. I think I'm still learning what they mean.